Welcome back. Across the United States, wildlife experts are asking people to keep an eye out for an insect called the spotted lanternfly. The small but mighty creature could pose a threat to nature and the surrounding wildlife. Joining me now to discuss the dangers of the spotted lanternfly is Research Associate Professor for the Department of Entomology at Pennsylvania State University, Dr. Julie Urban. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for this opportunity, Kibin.
Now, I'm really excited to talk about this because it's something I've heard a little bit about, but I'm really excited to know a little bit more. Can you first start off by telling us what is a spotted lanternfly?
Yes, despite the common name, spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper. And so the species that folks are most familiar with, that's its closest relative, is the cicada. And so spotted lanternfly is from Asia, and so that makes it an invasive species. It's not natural to this area.
And can you actually tell us, what are invasive species?
Yes, so invasive species are species that get transported by humans to some area that's outside of their natural historic range. And so just being an invasive species doesn't necessarily make any given species, plant or animal, that gets transported a problem, but typically they often become problems because when they get transported, what doesn't come with them are their natural enemies, their predators, their parasites, and their pathogens that normally keep their populations in check. So they get here and they're unchecked by these other forces. And so oftentimes they can kind of get out of control and become a problem.
Okay, so were the spotted lanternfly transported here by people?
Yes, it was. So
Oh.
we think what happens, like this particular species and other closely related lanternflies, do things that are really unusual for a sap feeding insect. They lay their eggs on essentially anything. So normally you would lay your eggs, where your offspring can hatch and feed, and offspring don't have wings. And so you would think you would lay your eggs on a tree host, where your offspring could feed. But because lanternflies are so incredibly mobile, they can roam around and find food no matter what. They lay their eggs on anything. And so lanternfly eggs most likely got transported here on a shipment most likely of stone, because they got shipped into a landscaping business. So basically the lanternfly egg mass or egg masses were likely laid either on the pallet or on the shipment themselves. And because they look like dried mud, it's easy not to detect them. So that's how they got here.
Wow, so talking about the looks a little bit, what are some characteristics people should look for when they're trying to spot a spotted lanternfly?
Well, certainly you'd want to keep your eyes out for egg masses so you don't transport those over the winter months. And on Penn State Extension's Spotted Lanternfly webpage, there's all sorts of great pictures. But right now, they're not quite to their mating and egg laying stage. So what you want to keep an eye out for are the adults. And so they're gray, they're very characteristic. They have these black spots on them. If they open up their wings, you see red hind wings and yellow bellies. But you really, really want to yes, perfect picture, keep an eye out for that. Because now and moving forward in the fall, if you come across that, that very well could be a mated female. And we know that spotted lanternfly get into new areas because they're transported by humans, either as those egg masses or as adult females that are already mated. And those are what get them into new areas. And you really, really don't want to transport those. So right now, make sure you know what an adult looks like and don't transport that.
Now, where are these insects located within the US and how are they affecting those areas?
Okay, so lanternfly right now is in 34 counties within Pennsylvania, but there's established populations. Perfect. This is the best map. And they're in all states contiguous with it. And so those blue areas are areas where there's established populations of lanternfly and they're under quarantine. But basically, you can see they're also in disjunct states. So in Virginia, in North Carolina, in Massachusetts, Rhode Island as well, and Connecticut. And there's populations also in Michigan and Indiana. And so it's impacting those states is that it'll feed on sap of a lot of different plants, but what it's feeding can actually damage our grapevines, wild grapevines and cultivated grapevines. And so the main impacts right now are that it damages grapes. They can feed in really high numbers, and that has already proven to be sufficient to kill grapevines. The other way they do damage, you can see in this photo right here, is if you're a sap feeding insect and you feed on sugary sap, then your excrement is sugary, and we call that excrement honeydew. And so that honeydew, when it falls on any plants underneath where lanternfly are feeding, it's itself a food resource for sooty mold. And so sooty mold is a blackened mold that grows on this honeydew, and you saw that covering that understory plant. And so how it's more of a problem for wildlife is that that honeydew that grows on understory plants, which includes, grapevine, wild grapevine, mulberry, other things, those are all food resources for wildlife. And so that sooty mold reduces the plant's ability to photosynthesize and make food for itself. And so lanternfly, besides damaging grapes, secondarily is damaging from the sooty mold.
Wow, I didn't know that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, are they harmful to humans in any way?
Other than this impact to grapevines, and no, their mouth parts are fused into a straw-like beak, and it actually can't penetrate human tissue. And so whatever they land on, they crawl up. So if they happen to land on you, they'll crawl up the back of your legs, the back of your neck, and they have little claws that people, can pinch, especially if you don't know it's there. And so it might pinch a little bit, but they're not capable of hurting humans.
Okay, so I guess if anything, that's pretty good. We don't have to worry about getting any bites or anything like that. So thank you for sharing that. Now, I want to know the spotted lanternfly is currently under quarantine in 34 counties in Pennsylvania, in addition to several other states. Can you explain what that actually means?
So under quarantine, basically quarantine provides a set of rules and essentially guidance for people to follow, businesses and lay people alike, to make sure that they don't transport lanternfly to new areas. And so there's also there's a permitting process where if people take training that's available free online that tells them what they need to do, and businesses in particular, to prevent spreading lanternfly to new areas. And so that quarantine is essentially just basically those areas where we know lanternfly is established and where rules are in place to prevent the further spread.
Now, I'm really curious to know how, or possibly even when, was it discovered that these insects could be a threat to nature and then eventually to wildlife?
Actually, the spotted lanternfly was an invasive insect that showed up in South Korea in 2004. And there it was reported that it did damage to grapevines, but also stone fruit, timber, a lot of different crops. And so we were it was on our radar, and we were looking out for it. And so when it was first detected here in 2014, we knew what to watch for. And so to date, we don't see it damaging any of those other industries. We don't see it being a problem in tree fruit or to ornamental trees in your yard. It's more of a stressor, but it doesn't directly kill them. And we're still watching that to make sure it's not a problem. But basically, because we knew it would impact vineyards, or thought it would, from South Korea, we're really watching vineyards. And in fact, yes, that's where we do see that feeding, killing vines in some cases, but also really weakening vines and being a big problem.
Now, I think it's really interesting that it first landed in New York in about 2014, because I only recently heard about this maybe this or last year. So that's really interesting. But when I heard about it, I know that several public parks were advocating for squishing a spotted lanternfly if you see one. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about this campaign, and is this the best way for everyday people to go about it?
Yes, I think so. Basically, the idea is that certainly this isn't the whole management plan. This thing showed up in 2014, and within 2 weeks, the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and United States Department of Agriculture put together management plans. And so, they're continuing to treat with insecticides and herbicides to attack favorite hosts. So there's a more complex management plan. We're not like relying on the public's shoes, to kill these insects and manage it. But the idea is because they really get transported by humans, and that's what makes them such a problem. So this idea of the Stop It campaign is more along the lines of, if you don't kill it, you're likely to spread it. And so this idea, certainly, it is really important. It's as much about human awareness as anything else. So yes, if you see it, stomp it, because otherwise you might carry it. And so right now, in terms of where it is in New York State, it has a really patchy distribution. Even though it's kind of been around, you don't really recognize it until it's big in your area. And so even though it's in New York City, it is not yet established or in those vineyards, the beautiful vineyards out on Long Island, nor in the vineyards out in the Finger Lakes. And so what we need is the public to potentially buy us time. Be aware of it, stomp it, don't transport it, keep it out of those vineyards while the large research community that's working on this insect comes up with longer term solutions to manage it a lot better.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that because I know prior to this, I thought it was just, oh, stomp it and the problem's over. So thank you so much for explaining that. Now, can you talk a little bit more about what is needed to find long-term sustainable solutions?
Basically time to do the research. And so, they pulled together a technical group of scientists right in 2014 within 2 weeks of them finding it. I'm one of those folks. There's folks from USDA who are scientists who immediately went to spotted lanternflies' native range, in this case in China, to find those natural enemies. And some of those enemies are wasps that lay their eggs in the eggs of lanternfly or lay their eggs in the nymphs of lanternfly and kind of eat the insects from the inside out. So they would be kind of like surgical tools that could kill lanternfly and really be very specific to lanternfly and could be good solutions. But it takes a lot of time to do that research. We also have a lot of other irons in the fire in terms of different research things that are going on in terms of improved management and such longer term solutions that are less reliant on chemicals. And so if you're interested in that, we have a website for my grant in particular that's a large regional grant, stopslf.org. But again, that's just kind of 7 institutions of folks, but there's literally hundreds of researchers working on a lot of better long-term solutions. We just need to prevent its further spread to buy us time to come up with those solutions.
Now, I'm curious to know, is it hard to do research on an insect that you don't want it to spread, but if it doesn't spread, maybe it's not there anymore? Can you talk about the challenges of conducting research on something that's a little bit challenging?
Oh, Kibin, that's such a great question. This is why it's really problematic for grapevines in particular. Where this insect is, it's 3 hours from our campus in Penn State. And so we don't have experimental grapevines set up. And so it's hard to go up to a grapevine, to a grape grower and say, hi, we have this insect. And when it feeds, it kills grapes. Can we do research on your grapes? It's been really problematic to work on that. And so that's why it kind of takes a long time for this research to go. And because this insect only lives one generation per year, you have your chance to research it in the wild. And if you miss your window, you're kind of out of luck. Certainly we try to rear it, and a lot of folks are trying to rear it in lab settings, but it's very, very challenging. It feeds so heavily that it's really challenging to rear in the lab. And so when I talk about needing to buy time, it's exactly these kind of, I don't want to say delays. Research is complex. It just does take that kind of time. But myself and literally 100 other researchers working on this, we get out of bed every day because we're convinced that we're going to come up with better solutions.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. I learned so much.
Great. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, Kibin.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.